Stevie Ray Vaughan. And of course, you don't even need to see the video to know it's Stevie Ray Vaughan. But have you ever thought about how famous guitarists got their great tones? We're going to look into that, and you might be a little surprised of how much or how little equipment they use to get their iconic guitar sounds. That's next on KT and the Trout Tech Tips. Watching a video recently of Joe Bonamassa, and he was being interviewed, and he just started talking about that Royal Albert Hall show where he had Eric Clapton step on stage and play with him during the performance of Further On Up the Road. What really was interesting to me was what Joe said about Eric Clapton's rig. It wasn't much. This is what he said. He said basically Clapton showed up with a Fender amp, a monster guitar cable, and a Strat. That's it. There was nothing else. There was no pedals, there was no extra effects, just Eric Clapton playing Eric Clapton. And it started making me think about, well, are there a lot of other performers that have done the same thing? Or are we just a group of guitarists now that just have to have an array of pedals on the floor every time we perform to get all the effects we need? Well, let's check out a few of the great guitarists and see what they used as they performed some of their iconic riffs.
This is Les Paul and Mary Ford in 1951. You're probably familiar with the guy on the right. That's Lester Pulfus, aka Les Paul. If you've ever heard a slapback delay, you can think of this guy. But more importantly, Les Paul invented, you got it, the Les Paul guitar. If it wasn't for Les Paul and the fact that he also invented multi-track recording, who knows where we'd be nowadays? Les shoved a phonograph needle into a block of wood with strings, ran it through his phonograph, and called it electric guitar. His riffs are iconic. He went on to become one of the most celebrated guitarists in American history. He played until he was in his 90s in New York City, and musicians and rock stars from all over the world would stop by and see Les. So if you want to think about a grandfather of the electric guitar and tone, this is the guy, Les Paul.
After Les Paul, there are many guitar players that came along in the 60s and created some of their own tones. But two guys really stood out. They were with this little known group called the Beatles. Now, you don't really think of tone when it comes to George Harrison and John Lennon, but if you go back to listening to iconic riffs like, I don't know, Paperback Writer, Day Tripper, Rain, I could just go on and on. Those guys were familiar with their Vox amps, and that's really all they had. There was no special effects. Once again, a guitar, a cable, and an amp. But those riffs and that tone has lasted for decades. What hasn't been said about Jimi Hendrix? The accolades go on forever. But there's that Hendrix tone that still now, 50 years later, we talk about it. How did he get the Hendrix tone? Well, he used Marshall amps, and he had a wah-wah, and then a fuzz box. That was it. No array of pedals on the stage floor, just Jimi Hendrix being Jimi Hendrix. It amazes me sometimes how we think about having to buy pedals and effects and all that to get a great tone. But Hendrix is one that he made his own tone. And people still today, as I say, continually investigate how to replicate his tone. I think that ability to do that died with him. But he was the only one that kept easy peasy playing. The next guy, although he didn't use Marshall amps, was still a great guy playing with simple equipment. I'm talking about the great B.B. King.
Now here it is, 3 o'clock in the morning, and I can't even close my eyes. Oh, it's 3 o'clock.
And if you hadn't seen the video, if you were a B.B. King fan like me, you didn't need to see the video. As soon as you heard that sweet sounds out of his Lucille and those spins that he always did, that's all B.B. King needed. He played the semi-hollow body guitar, I think, all of his life, plugged in with a cable to an amp. Do you see a pattern here? He used twins, I think, for a long time, and then he went to the Lab series, and I don't know towards the end of his life what he was using, but he was just clean. That's what I call a very clean tone. And B.B. King was great at it. And there won't be another B.B. King. But there again, there seems to be a pattern. A guy, a guitar cable, and an amp. Makes me think. Well, who should we look into next that's going to get us off this simple pattern of playing a guitar through an amp? Let me think about it. February 10th, 1978 may just seem like a regular day on the calendar. But it was a day that music changed. Well, rock music changed. I remember hearing this song, oh yes, on the FM radio. And I thought, who is this guy playing guitar and how is he doing what he's doing? Eddie Van Halen changed the music in the rock industry forever. Between his Floyd Rose and his incredible ability to tap, things changed a lot. Everybody wanted to run out and get a Kramer guitar. I remember that. But Eddie really wasn't into a lot of extra effects and everything. Once again, a guy with a guitar driving a whole bunch of power through some amps. And he knew how to do it great. So that was a tone that Eddie set. And it was what they call the Brown sound. There's all sorts of discussion about how he did what he did, but that's not important. The important thing about it was Eddie had his own tone. And many people now still try to play just like Eddie. A lot of tribute bands out there playing Van Halen songs, and guys that probably weren't even born in 1978 picking up his abilities to tap and drive those Marshall amps. Eddie Van Halen was one of a kind, and the kind of guy that knew his tone, and that's great. Now we're going to go from someone driving a Marshall amp to its peak to an effect that has changed the rock and roll history. Well, not just that, but a lot of musicians have used this piece of equipment. It's called the Echoplex. Invented in 1958 by a guy named Mike Battle. And if you're not familiar with the Echoplex, I'm sure you've heard a lot of songs that have echo delay on it. Now, the Echoplex was originally a tape machine that had a recording head and several playback heads. Then there was a regular piece of recording tape on a loop. You'd hit the first sound and then decide on the speed of the delay by speeding up or slowing down the tape. So you'd get the dot, 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 and then each head would fade out the sound. I caught on to it early and couldn't hardly wait to get my hands on it, being able to play an Echoplex. I couldn't afford them, only the big guys had those. And then in the 80s, Digitech came out with a digital version of it, and I used it all the time. And I still use it. I love the sound of echo delay. But one of the most famous, iconic guitarists to ever use delay is this guy. Yes, the Edge of U2. If he didn't have a delay on his songs, I don't know where he'd be. But he doesn't use an Echoplex anymore. He uses an array of pedals and effects to get that iconic U2 sound that he has on so many of the recordings that YouTube has done. I love the sound. I wish I'd come up with it. But he took it and changed it to his own tone. Now, see, you might argue that, is that a tone? Well, we won't get into all the extra equipment that the Edge uses, whether it's like vintage amps or anything else, his guitars. We're going to just talk about the delay and how much he uses it on a lot of songs. Is that tone? I think it is. And I think his playing and has changed the rock history of being able to delay and make it a sound of its own. So the question is, can you find unique tone anymore? I'm sure people watching this are probably wondering why I didn't talk about other players. Alex Lifeson, Billy Gibbons, Eric Clapton. I could go on for a lot of different players. But I have gotten to the point where I think it's more important to find your own tone. I don't know if that's possible anymore. But I'm going back to more of a unique sound, and that is more of direct of, you got it, guitar, a chord, and an amp. So much of what we do comes from ourselves, not from other players. So my suggestion, if you're a player, and if you're new, try to find your own tone. And if you've been playing for decades like me, you probably have your own tone, but keep making the best music you can and keep sharing it with the world. Because one of the things I do know is the next Jimi Hendrix, the next Jeff Beck are still out there to be found. This is The Trout with KT and the Trout Tech Tips. I'll see you next time.